Welcome to the third lesson in the second book of Samuel. This is the last years of King David's rule. The last years of David's life were filled with struggles within his family. His sons vied for the throne and nearly created a civil war. His general Joab challenged David's decisions and sometimes caused more strife. The sons of David who might possibly inherit the throne were Ammon, Daniel, Absalom, Adonijah, and the three sons of Bathsheba. Here is David's family tree. We looked at this last week. We'll look at it again a couple times this week. Remember, David's father is Jesse, his grandfather is Obed, and his great-grandparents are Boaz and Ruth. But David himself is part of a family that has brothers and sisters. One of his sisters, this one, is particularly important in her relationship because her sons, the three sons, Abishai, Joab, and Asahel, are David's nephews, and they play a role in his household and in his rule of the kingdom. And his sons that are in line for inheriting the kingdom are Ammon, Absalom, Adonijah. These are the three important ones. And then we know in the end, it's actually the last one, Solomon, who becomes the king. In Absalom's rebellion, there's a narrative, a format narrative to the story that has a symmetrical structure. And in chapters 13 through 16, once Absalom approaches the city of Jerusalem with his supporters, David is forced to leave. And then there is the conflict of advisors that David has. And then the two armies meet each other. And so conflict of armies in chapters 17 through 19. And then finally, David is able to return to Jerusalem in the end of chapter 19. So these chapters between 13 and 19 are all about the rebellion of Absalom and the encounters between Joab and Absalom and David. Following several years in exile due to the killing of Ammon, Absalom is back in Jerusalem, but he was not allowed to see the king. Absalom surrounded himself with the trappings of a royal prince and an heir apparent. The chariot, horses, and 50 men, presumably soldiers or bodyguards, that accompanied him on his movements around Jerusalem must have given him considerable public visibility. He begins to garner the favor of the people by coming out each morning and sitting at the gate of the city. And when people brought a case to the king for judgment, Absalom would ask where in Israel they were from, and they would tell him their tribe. And then Absalom would say, "You've really got a good, strong case here. It's too bad the king doesn't have anyone to hear it." And he would say, "I wish I were the judge. Then everyone could bring their cases to me for judgment, and I would give them justice." When people tried to bow before him, Absalom wouldn't let them. Instead, he took them by the hand and kissed them. And Absalom did this with everyone who came to the king for judgment. And so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel by acting as though he could do better for them and acting humbly before them. And then Absalom went on to move to Hebron. And while he was there, he sent secret messages to all the tribes of Israel to stir up a rebellion against the king. As soon as you hear the ram's horn, his message read, you are to say Absalom has been crowned king of Hebron. In Hebron, Absalom would seem like his father, David, starting in a small location and gradually winning support of the people. Absalom is pronounced king at Hebron. Hebron was a symbolically appropriate place for his announced coup. It was an ancient Yahwistic shrine and the capital of the tribe of Judah. Absalom himself was born there, but more important, David was anointed king in Hebron over Judah and then Israel. David is forced to take his household and flee the city once Absalom approaches Jerusalem with his assembled followers. Others joined David as he traveled. At some point, David sent two servants back to Jerusalem with the Ark of the Covenant, and while they were there, they were to serve as spies. The king also told Zadok the priest, look, here's my plan. You and Abiathar should return quietly to the city with your son, Ahimaaz, and Abiathar's son, Jonathan. I will stop at the shallows of the Jordan River and wait there for a report from you. So Zadok and Abiathar took the ark of God back to the city and stayed there. David and his people proceed on their way over the Mount of Olives. David weeps, his head is covered, he walks on bare feet. This is not the portrait of a political or a military retreat. It is a penitential procession. David had cast his fate in the hands of God, and he moves forward in penance and in supplication for God's mercy. His people join him in these acts of ritual penance. Hushai and Archite are also sent to Jerusalem to infiltrate the group surrounding Absalom there. David now musters his men together that are with him, and he appoints generals and captains to lead them. And the king gave his command to Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, for my sake, deal gently with young Absalom. And all the troops heard the king give this order to his commanders. And this is important to note that David wanted precautions taken regarding his son. Absalom, on the other hand, chose a man named Amasa as his military leader. After a season of hiding up and building up an army, David's men and Absalom's men engaged in a battle. David's men prevailed, and Absalom was killed by Joab, which gave David a reason to hate Joab. And there had been previous conflicts between Joab and David in the past, but this was almost too much for David. Well, during the battle, Absalom happened to come upon some of David's men. He tried to escape on his mule, but as he rode beneath the thick branches of a great tree, his hair got caught in the tree. His mule kept going and left him dangling in the air. Enough of this nonsense, Joab said, and he took 3 daggers and plunged them into Absalom's heart as he dangled. He was still alive in the great tree, and 10 of Joab's young armor bearers then surrounded Absalom and killed him. And so when you think, what did David command Joab and the generals, was to take it easy on Absalom. So I don't think he wanted him killed. He probably wanted him to be brought to himself. So David returned to Jerusalem, and on the way he encountered those who were willing to reset him as the king. And there were a group of Benjamites who were against David. The men from Benjamin were also descendants of Saul. So the final years of David's reign were not years of blissful contentment. The division that finally permanently ruptured the kingdom after Solomon's death was already present and at work in David's kingdom. So a new order is reestablished here. Now Joab was the commander of the army of Israel. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was captain of the king's bodyguard. Adoniram was in charge of forced labor. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was the royal historian. Shiva was the court secretary. Zadok and Abiathar were the priests, and Ira, a descendant of Yair, was David's personal priest. This is the same Yair or Yael that was driving a stake through the tent, or in the tent through the head of one of the generals way back when. Joab and David. In the Bible, we find a partnership between King David and the general who directed Israel's army that proved to be highly effective in many ways. That general was David's nephew, Joab, who served David through his tenure as Israel's most famous king. Joab was an effective military leader who had no shortage of courage and managed the armies of Israel with skill and daring. He served Israel well in his office. And yet the relationship between him and David was a strained one, to say the least, particularly following the death of Absalom. Joab also hated Abner for killing his brother Ashel in a previous battle that took place some time before this. And the idea of Abner, who had killed his brother, taking his place as David's top general was just too distasteful to contemplate for this hot-headed Joab. So Abner was on his way to see David and to offer his alliances, or had offered his alliance to David, and was traveling, and during that time Joab intercepted him, and this is what happened. When he, that is Joab, overtook Abner and his men, Joab feigned friendliness and he went to greet his rival. As the two men embraced, Joab pulled out a long dagger and ran it through Abner's belly, killing him instantly. In this one murderous act, he effectively eliminated his competition, guaranteeing the top military position for himself. And apparently Joab's brother, Abishai, was also involved in this murder, because the scripture says, so Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner. So Abner leads Absalom's revolt. He pursued David. He had a conflict with Saul's son. He made a deal then to join up with David. Joab protected David. He believed his position was in danger from Abner, and then he killed Abner. So it's family politics put David in a very precarious situation here. Zeruiah was David's sister. And the mother of three sons we saw in the family chart, Joab, Abishai, and Ashael. They were all outstanding soldiers. They were tough guys, so tough that even David was hesitant to rebuke them or remove them from leadership over Israel's army. Of course, they were also family, and that always complicates things. In addition to this, rebellions and coups are often the result when the top army commander has a major falling out with the political commander. But this was something David seemed to be willing to risk. And here we have that family tree again. Here is David, here's his sister. Here are the three brothers that are in the military. And here is Ammon. Absalom kills Ammon. Joab kills Absalom. And now we have Adonijah as the next person in line for the throne. Now, a long time before this, when we were settling into Canaan in the early days in chapter 9 of Joshua, there was an incident where a group of Gibeonites came dressed poorly and as though they had been traveling for a long time, and they were kind of in disguise, and they were presenting themselves falsely to Joshua and seeking asylum, or to be assured that they would not be destroyed when Joshua and the Israelites take over the land. So they presented themselves falsely, and because of that, once it was found out, they were made to be enslaved by Israel as water carriers and wood cutters and so on. This took place early on, and then when Saul was king, he broke the promise and created a blood guilt situation when he tried to annihilate this group of people, the Gibeonites, and he fought against them, going against what had been the agreement passed down from Joshua. So keep that story kind of in the back of your mind as we move on. We talked about blood guilt in the past, and a claim of blood guilt was on the house of Saul because of what they had done to the Gibeonites for when they committed the atrocities against them. So again, the Gibeonites wanted some restitution, and so they received 7 of Saul's remaining sons, and they were executed. Now, we can judge David to be capable of some political opportunism here in using an old charge of the blood guilt from Saul onto the Gibeonites as a way to eliminate some of the potential rivals he may have through Saul's line of descendants. And this shows David to be a ruthless politician who took advantage of a situation against an old enemy. And he eliminates Saul's heirs as potential rivals in this manner. After David's return to Jerusalem, there are several encounters with individuals, and then the sort of an appendix to his lifetime of action. Scholars think this was tagged onto the story later during editing. The descriptions of his military exploits is so different from the other kinds of writings, and the selection of poetry seems added on as well. The last 3 or so chapters. Some of these lists of exploits and lists of people who served in the reign are remarkable because the absence of any reference to David is lacking in them. Israel had other heroes than David. The kingdom and its successes, particularly against the Philistines, were not totally dependent on David. However, the mention of victory as the gift of the Lord makes clear that the kingdom's future had been in God's hands all along. And towards the end, David commands a census to be taken. It's an odd story also that's tacked on here at the end of the book. And it makes us wondering why God would be angry and judgmental about this action. But it seems that the purpose of the census was to conscript military men and also to propose taxation. Joab conducted the consensus and he reported the number of people to the king. But notably, we notice the military men, or men of age for military that can handle a sword, are what's the primary number here. 800,000 capable warriors from the northern area of Israel and 500,000 from the southern area known as Judah. That's a considerable number of people for the size of population at the time. So we can kind of take some of those numbers with a little grain of salt. So in this action, David had taken a major step away from tribal military behavior, and he's definitely creating a centralized royal control. His census is a step toward the fulfillment of the prophet Samuel's dire warning against the kings who take from the people when Samuel warned about what it would be like if you have a king in Samuel chapter 8. Such a royal census is not a neutral act, but it's a testimony of state power and the intent to use that power. So in January, we will pick up with more palace intrigue as David's third son, Adonijah, seeks the throne, and Bathsheba upsets this idea. So we can kind of think back to Genesis once more and say trickery is going to be used to accomplish the work of the kingdom of Israel. A connection for today, though, is that for some in Israel, establishing that David had lived and moved his capital to Jerusalem in around 1000 BCE is important because it gives modern Jews a historical claim to the land, and especially to the city of Jerusalem. And for the same reason, it's politically important to others to question the historicity of David's story. To sum it up, I'll show you this little video.
The book of 2 Samuel. Check out the video on 1 Samuel where we were introduced to the book's three main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David, and then also to the book's literary design, which first introduced Samuel and then traced the rise and fall of King Saul in contrast to the rise of King David. 2 Samuel tells the story of David as Israel's king, and in two movements. There's a season of success and of blessing, followed by a huge moral failure and then its sad consequences. And then the book ends with this well-crafted conclusion that reflects back on the good and the bad in David's life, generating hope for a future king to come from his line. So 2 Samuel picks up after Saul's death, and David surprises everyone by composing this long poem where he laments the death of the very man who tried to murder him. And so once again, the author, he's presenting David's humility and compassion. He's a man who grieves the death even of his own enemies. After this, David experiences a season of success and God's blessing. All of the Israelite tribes, they come to David and then they ask him to unify all the tribes as their king. And so the first thing David does as king is to go to the city of Jerusalem. He conquers it, and he establishes it as Israel's capital city, which he renames as Zion. And from there, David goes on and he wins many battles and expands Israel's territory. Now, after making Jerusalem the political capital of Israel, he wants to make it their religious capital as well. And so he has the Ark of the Covenant moved into the city. And then in 2 Samuel 7, he tells God, now that Israel has a permanent home, he thinks that God's presence should also get a permanent house. So he asks if he can build a temple for the God of Israel. But God says to David, thank you for that thought, but actually I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty. Now, 2 Samuel 7, this is a key chapter for understanding the storyline of the whole Bible, because God here makes a promise to David that from his royal line will come a future king who's going to build God's temple here on earth and set up an eternal kingdom. And it's this messianic promise to David that gets picked up and developed more in the book of Psalms and also in the books of the prophets. And it's this king that gets connected to God's promise to Abraham. The future messianic kingdom will be how God brings his blessing to all of the nations. And it's right here, in the midst of all this divine blessing, that things go horribly wrong. David makes a fatal mistake. Not fatal for him, but for a man named Uriah, one of David's prize soldiers. So from his rooftop, David sees Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, bathing. David finds her, he sleeps with her, gets her pregnant, and then he tries to cover the whole thing up by having Uriah assassinated and then marrying her. It's just horrible. So when David's confronted by the prophet Nathan about all of this, he immediately owns up to what he's done. He's broken, he repents, he asks God to forgive him, and God does forgive him, but God doesn't erase the consequences of David's decisions. And so as a result of this horrible choice, David's family, his kingdom, it all falls apart. And it makes this section a tragic story, much like Saul's downfall. So David's sons end up repeating his own mistakes, but in even more tragic ways. So Amnon sexually abuses his sister Tamar, and then their brother Absalom finds out about all of this and has Amnon assassinated. And then Absalom goes and he hatches the secret plan to oust his father David from power, and he launches this full-scale rebellion. And so for a second time, David is forced to flee from his own home and go hide in the wilderness, except this time he is not an innocent man. The rebellion ends when David's son is murdered, and it breaks David's heart. And so once again, he laments over the very man who tried to kill him. David's last days find him back on his throne, but as a broken man, he's wounded by the sad consequences of his sin. The book concludes with a well-crafted epilogue, with stories that are out of chronological order, but they have this really cool symmetrical literary design. So the outer pair of stories come from earlier in David's reign, and they compare the failures of Saul and then of David, and how each of them hurt other people through their bad decisions. The next inner pair of stories are about David and his band of mighty men who went about fighting the Philistines. And what's interesting is that both sections have a story of David's weakness in battle. So in contrast to the victorious David of chapters 1 through 9, here we see a vulnerable David who's dependent on others for help. The center of the epilogue has two poems that act like memoirs, and David reflects back on his life. And he remembers times when God graciously rescued him from danger. And he sees these as moments where God was faithful to his covenant promise to him and to his family. Both poems conclude by looking back onto the hope of God's promise of a future king who will build that eternal kingdom. Now these poems and then God's promise also connect back to Hannah's poem that opened the book. And so these key passages from the beginning, now the middle, and the end of the book bring the book's themes all together. Despite Saul and David's evil, God remained at work, moving forward his redemptive purposes. And God opposed David and Saul's arrogance, but he exalted David when he humbled himself. And so the future hope of this book reaches far beyond David himself. It looks to the future, to the Messianic king who will one day bring God's kingdom and blessing to all of the nations. And that's what the book of Samuel is all about.
All right, that brings a little summary for us and a conclusion to the book of both books of Samuel. So our reading suggested for Advent, which begins on the 1st of December, is to read the book of Luke in the New Testament, one chapter a day for 24 days, which will give you the story of Jesus. We'll return from winter break on January 9th. and we'll resume with the study of the books of Kings and continue on with our march through the Old Testament. Verse from Samuel, 2 Samuel 22, verse 31 for this week. This God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord proves true. He is a shield for all those who take refuge in him. And I wish you all a friend's Thanksgiving and a family of as well as friends Thanksgiving. Blessings on you, and I will see you in January.